Welcome to Policy on Demand. I'm Andrew Pryor. It's the end of the week, so you'll be forgiven if you expected our usual week in review. However, with House passage of the Budget Reconciliation Bill, we felt more detail was needed. And joining me to discuss what's happening with the One Big Beautiful Bill is Karl Russo, PwC's National Economics and Statistics Practice Leader. Karl, thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
So let's dive right in. The House did pass the bill narrowly. There were some Republican holdouts whose votes were needed for passage. What changes did they make to get those holdouts votes?
Yeah, so there were three big areas that members of the House Republican caucus had raised in negotiations to get the bill over the finish line in the House. And the first was changes related to Medicaid and work requirements there. But on the tax side, the two big issues were state local tax deductions. So the SALT caucus had issues, and also changes to the Inflation Reduction Act's energy credits and other incentives. And so that's where we saw big movements. On the SALT deduction, the pressure was to raise that limit above the $10,000 limit that's currently in place. And so the bill took that up to $40,000 beginning this year, and phasing out that increase at the $500,000 adjusted gross income level. The changes to the IRA incentives, many of those were curtailed sooner than was in the original bill, so those mostly now ending after 12/31/2028.
Excellent. And on the SALT cap, I thought at one point they were talking about a $751,000 income threshold for the phase out. What changed there for the SALT caucus members? I would have thought they wanted something more generous.
Yeah, so I think that the versions that were being talked about at that level of income were only temporary in nature. The changes that we have in the current amendment are lasting for the entire budget window, and that $500,000 income threshold that we see this year is actually increased by 1% every year through the budget window. And so I think they were opting for something that was more long-lasting in nature.
And on the energy credits, anything favorable in those changes?
There were a few changes that were in the positive direction for those credits for some of the moderate members who were interested in seeing expansions there, or at least not as aggressive a curtailment of those incentives, particularly in the nuclear tax credit incentives. Those were given a little bit longer of a life than they had in the original Ways and Means passed bill.
Now, I know you've been spending a lot of time looking through the manager's amendment that made these changes to get those votes, but there are other changes in there that aren't specifically aimed at maybe the holdouts, but they seem like important changes. Can you discuss those and why they might be in there?
When the bill moves to the Senate's going to be operating under a current policy baseline. And for the budget rules there, they need to make small changes to each provision in order to have revenue effects relative to the sort of straight extension of those provisions. So we did see some changes already were in the Ways and Means passed bill, but some additional ones here. So on the international side, we saw slight increases in the effective tax rates for global intangible low taxed income, the GILTI rate, and the rate on foreign derived intangible income, FDII. Those go from 13 1/8 effective rates to 13.335, very small increase there. And the rate on the base erosion anti-abuse tax goes from 10% to 10.1%.
Gotcha. Other changes you noticed in the bill that might be of interest to our viewers?
So there were a number of provisions that were changed, some of which are not very significant in nature. You know, they changed the name of the investment accounts from the MAGA accounts to the Trump accounts. The tanning tax is back, so that was not repealed. And then there were some other sort of substantive provisions. There's one related to changing the regulatory presumption on sort of disguised sale rules for partnerships. That was a new addition. But the larger changes were definitely on the SALT and international side.
Excellent. And maybe also a change in how the PTET rule works?
That's correct. So within the SALT rule, I don't think this is necessarily a change in policy, but a change in sort of a technical fix of the statute to do what they thought they were doing. There's a curtailment on that increase for pass-through entity tax workarounds in the states if you are in a specified service, trade, or business, like accounting. Mm-hmm. And there was some concern that the definition of substitute payment that was included in those rules would have swept in other qualified businesses under the Section 199 Cap A regime, and that appears to be unintended. It looks like that they've made some changes to the statutory text to address that.
All right, so those are some of the key House changes. There's others, and we're going to get an insight out, I think, that'll go into all of that. But let's shift over to the Senate. Now that the bill has been passed by the House, they head out for the Memorial Day recess period. Congress returns the following week for a 4-week legislative work period, and the Senate is expected to take up the bill. What are you anticipating, or what are we hearing might be in play in terms of potential modifications that would be critical to our companies?
Yeah, so one of the things that we're hearing is it looks like the Senate's going to probably try to make a move in the direction of permanence on some of the temporary provisions that were included in the House bill, particularly as you think about the 3 TCJA business orphans, as some people are calling them. So on bonus depreciation, on the interest limitation and R&D expensing. There are a movement probably to move those dates out, and the Senate has a little bit larger of a tax instruction, so they have a little bit more room to do that, maybe as much as $1 trillion or more that they can spend some of on making those provisions permanent. Some of the other things that we're hearing is there might be a little less zeal for the large increase in the SALT cap in the Senate. There aren't any senators from any blue states, really, so that's not as much of an issue there as it was in the House. So maybe we see some movement back on that. And also on some of the energy provisions, that there might be a little bit more support for at least some of those provisions and some of the expansions in the Senate than what we saw in the House. So you might see some movement on some of those things as well.
And I don't know if you mentioned it, Senator Tillis had introduced a bill to make some, improvements to the GILTI, the BEAT, and the FDII provisions. Could there be an appetite for maybe expanding on what the House did there?
That's right. So Senator Tillis did introduce legislation that would make a number of changes to the international regime. And so it's possible that there'll be some push to include some of those provisions in the bill, depending on the amount of revenue room that's left in the instruction after they do some of the other things that they would like to do. But that's a piece of legislation that's out there that has some modifications in that space as well.
All right. So final question. The markets don't seem to be reacting very well to the budget reconciliation bill, or at least that's how it's reported, that perhaps there's some concerns that it would increase federal budget deficits. And yet I've heard many Republicans talk about this bill as not adding to the deficit and maybe having a small deficit reduction. How do you square the circle on those two views of the bill?
So the conventional score of the legislation is probably going to show a revenue or a deficit increase of about $2.5 trillion, maybe a little less than that. We've got about $4 trillion of tax cuts on net, and maybe $1.6 trillion on spending reductions, maybe a little bit more. We'll wait to see what the final score of the changes that were included in the last round are. But that, on a conventional basis, is going to add $2 trillion plus to the deficit. The way you would then get something that would be consistent with it not increasing the deficit would rely on sort of macroeconomic effects of the bill that could potentially, as some have said, raise significant amounts of revenue, maybe as much as $2.5 trillion or more. If that were the case, then you would see that would offset all of that conventional revenue score. We've not seen a macro analysis of the bill that would suggest that those additional revenues would be that size, but that would be what you would need in order to make those claims correct. What you're seeing, I think, in the markets is a reaction to what was a relatively weak demand for the Treasury auction earlier this week. That caused interest rates to be slightly higher on those instruments than people had hoped or were expecting. Rates above 5% on the 10-year note, for example. And so as those interest rates tick up, that puts even further pressure on the deficits in the future, given that interest payments are such a large component and a large growing component of the contributions to increasing deficits in the future. So I think that's one of the reasons why there's some reaction there in the markets. It's interesting because you would expect that there were large increases in the deficit projected under any scenario, and so it's a little surprising maybe that you'd see something this week in particular that would have caused such a large response. But I think those deficit concerns in the long run have been something that the Congressional Budget Office and other deficit hawks have been talking about for a long time. And so I think that's part of the reason why we even had some of this holdouts in the House, where some of those members who were more concerned about those items. We'll see how they play forward when we get through whatever the Senate does with this bill too, and that will change presumably the effects on the deficit as well.
Excellent. Well, Karl, thanks as always for joining us to share your insights.
Well, thank you for having me again.
There's a lot more to come on reconciliation and the path forward for this bill. There's a tax insight linked in the description of this episode. We'll have more analysis for you next week. And for our viewers in the U.S., have a good Memorial Day weekend. Take care.